Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Colonel Knight, the Deputy Commandant for the Infantry School, and I'd like to present the unique opportunity we have here this morning to hear from two current division commanders on both their lessons learned as well as the insights that they've seen, in addition to the challenges their different formations and organizations are experiencing. Given their insights, we would also ask to seek their perspective on what they're seeing evolve in the Eastern European theater at this point. Major General Eisenhower is the commanding general of the 1st Armored Division. He has served in numerous command and staff positions over his 31-year military career and has overseas and combat assignments in Panama, Bosnia, Germany, and Iraq. Major General Anderson is the commanding general of the 10th Mountain Division and currently forward deployed in Europe. He has served in numerous command and staff positions over his 32-year military career, which includes overseas and combat assignments in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Afghanistan, Iraq, Germany, and Romania. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Major General Gregory Anderson and Major General James Eisenhower. We'll start with Major General Anderson.
Hey, okay. Thank you, Colonel Knight, and thanks to General Buzzard and the whole Maneuver Center of Excellence for hosting this great forum. Really important to host these forums and to share our thoughts across the profession, so I applaud that. I'm also just like to recognize my colleague on the panel, Jim Eisenhower, a great, magnificent officer, and it's an honor to be on the panel with him. So, you know, the previous block on 2030 is appropriate for what we're going to talk about here with light infantry and what is light infantry's role in 2030. And you know, thank you to General Beagle and the Combined Arms Center and what they're doing to help transform the Army. And appropriately, the focus has been on our joint forcible entry and our heavy strike capabilities and formations for the specific roles that they'll have in future fighting and war plans. There's obviously a modernization focus there too. There's a significant amount of equipment and capabilities that need to go into those formations. And so while light infantry per se is not necessarily the focus for the 2030 transformation, what I'm going to pitch to you today is a case that we make it so, or we make it on par with it because of the importance of light infantry to modern warfare and where we're going. Just as a side note, many of you may know Colonel Brian Ducote. He and I and one of his superstar majors are writing a case for military review. It'll come out next year on the case for light infantry. What we're learning, what we're seeing, what Ukraine is telling us, and then and kind of what that means for us moving forward as an infantry community. I'm also, when we go to the Q&A piece, I'm also, because I'm over here in Europe right now, I'm happy to talk about anything we're working on, which is primarily division and corps level warfighting with our allies and kind of what that means in the direction we're taking. Okay, so on to light infantry. Let's get our terms right first right now, right? We call the 10th Mountain a light infantry unit, right? We call other units light infantry, but I'm not sure that that's accurate. And it is in name and in history and lineage, but not necessarily in organization, structure, or capability. And so, when we think about light infantry, not all of the infantry are the same. And you can see that quote there on the top of the slide from one of our great military and operational thinkers, Colonel Vastazega, and kind of how he binned the infantry. Three kinds of infantry. There's armored infantry, the ones that are typically task organized and operate in close proximity to heavy and armor forces, are regular infantry. Think motorized, striker, probably what we are today in the 10th Mountain Division, and then light. A different, and that's where we'll focus our attention. Light infantry is not new to us. I mean, you could argue that the American way of warfare, the underpinnings of it come from light infantry fighting that we learned from Native Americans, that we learned on the frontiers, that we learned during our war for independence, small groups of fighters and soldiers led by junior leaders conducting long movements in difficult terrain to raid and to ambush and to seize key terrain. So we've been doing it for a while. And I tell you, we kind of lost our way a little bit on this, but it's in our bloodstream. Light infantry, what makes them different? What makes it light infantry? They operate in small teams, specially equipped for their mission. They have special purpose attacks, spoiling attacks, infiltration, ambushes, raids. They thrive in complex and restrictive terrain, both in their ability to move, but also the ability to hide from their enemies. By leveraging these sorts of advantages, you're able to, light infantry can punch above their weight class. A lot of times they get to pick the point of attack. Then they can also disengage from, while still having the advantage of inflicting disproportionate losses and disruption on the enemy. Light infantry allows you to get behind the enemy main lines, fix them, create multiple dilemmas for them. But it's not without risk, right? These are discontiguous operations, platoons, companies led by captains, first sergeants, sergeant first classes, and lieutenants that are out there operating off of lines of communication primarily. And so it is difficult. But there's plenty of precedents there. You look at the top left part of that slide, plenty of precedents where light infantry have taken on greater numbers, greater firepower, greater capability, and through just hardiness, toughness, initiative, confident leaders, and use of terrain and mobility that's unique to them, they've been able to, again, cause disproportionate losses in the enemy. Think the Finland War, the Falklands, the Burma, Merrill's Marauders marching across Burma, or for the 10th Mountain Division, it's close to home for us. The Gothic Line for 6 months there, 1944 up to early 1945. The Fifth Army had tried for 6 months to break the Gothic Line. It had been repulsed by the Germans for 6 months. 10th Mountain shows up, very specially trained in mountain warfare. They get 1,000 soldiers on a night ascent of Riva Ridge on five different routes. Four of those 5 routes required fixed ropes to get their forces up. This is a night infiltration in the wintertime, in the fog, to get 1,000 people up on that ridge, capture it before the Germans even knew what had happened to them. And that was their first operation of the war. That effort and then the subsequent seizing of Mount Belvedere broke the Gothic Line in about 2 days. There, the value of what light infantry can do and the asymmetric advantages that they can pose. That's history. We're seeing the same thing happen and play out in Eastern Europe now as well. Whether or not groups of Ukrainian infantry infiltrating onto the flanks of approaching Russian columns early in the war and utilizing their mobility when the Russians lacked it to inflict significant losses through anti-armor ambushes and spoiling attacks. We're also seeing it now recently in current operations. And to assist in breaching, and also to fix enemy reserves, fix counterattack forces, and the whole host of things that you can do as part of a combined arms offensive operation. Okay, so we talked about the design a little bit and how it's part of our history and the relevance of it. The other thing that's going to make it important for 2030 is light infantry are fast in terms of deployment. You can show up and get formations of light infantry with relatively few vehicles and equipment into motion and into the point of need much faster than you can other formations, and much faster than you can for our current MTO, which I'll talk about later. And while China's a pacing threat and Russia's the acute threat, as we march towards 2030, there's going to be a host of other things we don't even see yet. So, for instance, in the 90s, while we were preparing, we were trying to figure out where war was going and preparing future capabilities for the next war. Haiti happened, Somalia happened, Bosnia happened, Kosovo happened, humanitarian disasters happened. And all these things we're not good at forecasting, but you need a force that's able to get there quickly and accomplish whatever mission is tasked to it. So, I talked about, let's talk about where we need to go here, I guess is probably, in terms of our design. So we're not there right now. What I described in the skill sets and the missions and the tasks that we need to do to have viable, effective light infantry formations exists in small isolated pockets and with certain individuals and in some small groups. But for the most part, I'll talk about the 10th Mountain in particular, we are encumbered with significant amount of vehicles, a lot of equipment, a lot of heavy stuff that requires wheels and tracks to actually move it. It's, like I said, it's more akin to being motorized. Light infantry are also absolutely dependent upon the effectiveness of lieutenants and NCOs to operate independently and away from lines of communication with tough field craft, detailed tactical planning, the ability to manage load, the ability to manage soldier energy, plan and sequence and then integrate capabilities at the platoon and company level. And we got a lot of work to do in that area. We're taking steps there, but there's a lot of work to be done. I'll talk about where the 10th Mountain's going to kind of get there. So when we look again, just make the case once more for light infantry and in particular what we're going to do in the mountain alpine areas. As we look at 2030, if you look at the bottom right part of that slide there, you'll just see three pictures, right? Potential areas of competition or conflict as we get further into this century. The Caucasus, you see the Arctic there. And then I had to get a picture in of Taiwan. If you notice, Taiwan is about 3/4 mountainous, significant mountains, and then the rest is predominantly urbanized, complex and restrictive terrain throughout. Again, these are areas where we anticipate conflict going into the future and are trying to prepare and organize for. And so the role of light infantry and where we're going in 2030 is significant. And the captains that are in this audience here and the NCOs, you're going to be critical to get us there. Our light infantry, physically, mentally tough. They've got to be physically and mentally tough. They've got to learn, they've got to get field craft expertise down. They've got to be able to go multiple days off caches or aerial resupply, or even in some cases, foraging is still part of the game as well. They've got to be able to move in restrictive terrain, mountains, jungles, cities a little less complex. Wherever a man can walk, right, or climb, is where light infantry can operate and will have to be effective. So there's going to be a special equipping piece of this as well. And I know General Schneider and PEO Soldier are looking at a lot of that stuff, but they're going to have to carry their own equipment. They're going to have to be brought in through the trains or aerial resupply or other ways to keep it in the fight, because we know that about 40% of your body weight is about all you can sustain for sustainable operations that you're carrying at the approach march rate of movement. So in terms of where we're going to build this capability in 10th Mountain, it starts with NCO ownership at all levels: corporals, sergeants, staff squad leaders, platoon sergeants. Their ability to get standards and discipline and field craft and security and the basics down understand soldier load, understand rates of march, understand how to manage soldier or energy is going to be critical. Small unit tactics, cunning, cleverness, and how to outfox and outsmart an enemy, bait them into an ambush, kill them, and then disappear. We need an NCO corps that can do that. We need lieutenants that can do that. Part of the training management to build that, right? Detailed, predictable, progressive training management that builds these skill sets focused really at the platoon and company level. Your effectiveness in training management will result in effective light infantry, the level of effectiveness in your light infantry formation. So for the 10th Mountain, the other piece we're doing is the physicality of being light infantryman or woman, getting into the terrain. There's no substitute for it. 10th Mountain, we've got folks just came back from the Andes Mountains in Chile, the Chilean Winter Warfare School. We got folks right now climbing mountains of Bulgarian mountain units in the Carpathians, and then next month they'll be in the Romanian Carpathians with Romanian mountain troops. We just got folks back from Finland, and then significant mountaineering courses across both civilian and military schools across North America, Slovenia, the Sierra Nevadas. And we're using our own backyard mountains there at Fort Drum in the Adirondacks to, again, build these skill sets to operate and move and sustain and maintain effectiveness in very tough terrain. And that's kind of how we start to build the core of what light infantry are about. I tell you, the other piece, I know there's a lot of big discussions at the GO level about how to kind of continue to build upon, not just for light infantry, for 2030 at large, getting rid of a lot of equipment that we have, we have to slim down to become light, and then stabilizing our people as they develop these expert skill sets and they get to that level of expertise we need to be world class. We need to stabilize them. And they need to continue to train until we achieve that irreversible momentum to have the light infantry we need moving forward. And so I appreciate the time, and I will give it back to Colonel Knight, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Sir, thank you. What we'll do is transition over to Major General Eisenhower.
Thanks, Scott. Good morning. My name is Jim Eisenhower. I command the 1st Armored Division in Fort Bliss. One slide, I think about 10 minutes, and then look forward to your questions. I want to start off first with thanking Curtis, Sergeant Major Dodson, and everyone behind the scenes that put on this conference every year. It's a first-class event, really important to our profession that we continue this dialogue, and I appreciate it. Thanks to Greg for dialing in while you're forward and have more work than you have time. And then I thank all of you who are here, even those who are told to be here. I hope we're going to give you a nugget or two and make your time worth it. So one slide here, but 3 words at the top, 4 words at the top, 3 topics. I'm going to focus on warfighting, but kind of tell you in the 1st Armored Division over the course of last year how combat readiness and discipline contribute to our ability to warfight. But all of this is really focused on what General Buzzard started with talking about, and that's driving change. And it might not be what you think in terms of driving change. I'm not going to go over some technological new item that we're trying to integrate or something we learned after using a different type of platform. This is really driving change in the mental or human dimension in our division as we look back, and I'll give you context of what informed this. A little over a year ago, we went into NTC and into the box under nets with 4 command nodes in September. It was uncomfortable, and so was combat. And that began a training glide path through the regular CPX series up into a warfighter with 3rd Armored Corps, 1st Cavalry Division, and 3rd UK. The 3 heaviest divisions in the world fighting with America's hammer there in the 3rd Armored Corps, and was really influential and is the basis for how I'm going to discuss driving change and the lessons we've learned. I split the slide into 2 parts. On the left, you're going to see 3 bullets there, and I'll talk about that. These are things we learned in the train-up, and we kind of figured out in the warfighter. On the right side, these are things we still need to learn, and we realize we're not that good at it. All right, but let me start with the first. Everyone in this room, at some point, has been in that lane where you laid down with a buddy, you had your M4 and your kit on, and you each were in the prone in front of 3 stacked logs. And it was an individual movement technique lane. And we learn then that there's value in a buddy announcing that he's moving and the other buddy provides covering fire. These basics we may have maintained in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last 20 years, but we've lost it at higher echelons. And we reinforced it, kind of stumbled into it in a warfighter, where we realized the value of this at echelon, whether it's company, battalion, brigade, or division. And at one point we had 2 divisions spanning a division boundary, and we were in what amounted to a buddy team movement. One division provided the fires to cover the other division's movement. Those principles work, and we need to remember that as we start to train at echelon, preparing for LISCO. Right? Sergeant Major of the Army stood up here and talked about brilliance in the basics. That's a very basic technique, but my message here is we've got to change our mindset and realize that that applies at echelon, those very basic fundamental principles that have always proven effective. And if you ask the Op 4, that created quite a dilemma for them. They couldn't find the boundary, and then we ended up churning through DTGs and a DAG because we were able to do that in concert with each other. The second thing, I recognized early with the staff an institutional bias to clear. We've been doing that for 20 years. It's understandable. But I go back to my own experience in the Maneuver Captain's Career Course back in 1947 at Fort Knox, where the SGI said, if you're ever tasked to clear, you go right back to the S3 and you say, are you sure that's what you want me to do? But it doesn't matter at what echelon, whether it's a battalion staff or it's all the way up at divisions and corps, we tend to use urban areas as objectives. And we need to make a deliberate decision before we do that. Are we terrain-oriented? Are we force-oriented? And then decide whether or not that's something we want to do. I don't mean for this to stand in contravention from what General Rainey mentioned this morning. I think we're going to have to fight in urban terrain. But we need to make a deliberate decision based off the mission, understanding that sometimes we can move faster, maintain the initiative, and present more dilemmas to an adversary if we fix or secure. We, as members of this profession, need to know the difference in secure and seize. Do you have to be on it, or do you just need to secure it? There's a difference between assault and retain. At echelon, we need to have these discussions and start to train it to make sure our soldiers understand the difference. Because if there's one thing we know in LISCO, movement in and of itself is a form of protection. And the second you stop, it doesn't matter how much you dig, you're going to be acquired, and then your risk goes up. The last thing, I'll ask you rhetorically, what pulls you forward? This gets to all domain reconnaissance and taking full advantage of everything in our inventory or everything to which we have access. At the division level, there's a lot that pulls me forward. I've got Apaches doing deep attacks, and they can pull us forward with recon objectives on the egress. They still have fuel, they still have capacity. Don't let them figuratively sleep on the way out. You've got other sorts of, you've got your own organizational or organic reconnaissance assets. Those can help you conduct reconnaissance and pull your unit forward. But what else do you have access to? I will never have, as a division commander, any tasking authority over any element of the triad. But by God, I will have lines of communication to each aspect of that triad and want to know what they're doing. I don't have to be read into everything. I just need to understand what's the temporal window, what cost are you imposing on the adversary, and then our staffs at Echelon can figure out how we take advantage of that. There's nothing like Siege SOTA being able to pull you forward with intel. Simply call and ask, what are you seeing? And they'll tell you everything they're seeing. There's nothing secret about it, but you've got to have the confidence to reach out to those capabilities and figure out what pulls you forward. The last thing I'll tell you is that we've got to have ways to scan and cull open source intel. I'm not going to use social media as a single source. I want to corroborate it, but boy, we've learned that you can pull a lot off of social media, and that might also help you pull yourself or your unit forward faster, and then again maintain momentum, which maintains initiative, which denies that to the enemy. Some of the things we didn't get done well, and we're looking to really work on over the course of the next year. The first is seed. I know you're tired of hearing when I was in the lieutenant or back in the 90s, but this is true. In the 1st Armored Division, we really didn't get seed down to where I was comfortable with it until about day 7 of a warfighter. That's a lot of wasted money and time. We should have had it right going in. Seed is going to be part and parcel of how we employ our assets, especially given the ranges that we're capable of now. And we've got to become far more proficient in seed. Our doctrine is sound. The JC doctrine is sound. But if we don't figure out how to do that through repetition, we're not going to reach the standard we used to maintain in the 90s and we must maintain today. At one point, I had someone from one of the communities tell me plus or minus 30 seconds. That's bullocks. It's plus or minus 10 seconds, plus or minus 10 meters. If the 101st can do that in the 1990s with BCT-era assaults, we can certainly do that with seed, and we've got to get back to that. That's only going to come through proficiency, and we've got to construct CTC rotations that really force us to do that. And the last thing I'll bring up, and something that we learned the hard way, is that the protection warfighting function now is everybody's business. And if we don't have a way to envision the protection bubbles, literally, put them on a screen, we're really vulnerable. As we continue to move at battalions, brigades, or divisions, those bubbles move. And when one critical element gets outside of that bubble, either inadvertently or deliberately, they're going to pay the price. And we need to get much better at realizing we've got a prioritized protection list, but we need to understand how we synchronize that PPL with the maneuver we anticipate conducting, and then that dynamic maneuver we conduct just to take advantage of a particular situation. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. Scott, back over to you and Greg. I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Okay, team, we'll open up with our first question. For each of you, and I know you alluded to some of this, sir, but just to highlight our shift focus back towards large-scale combat operations, and each of you has participated in warfighter exercises or had the opportunity to observe your units in CTC rotations. What are the things that are being done well, and where are the things that units can improve? I could start over with General Anderson. I'll hand off to you.
Yeah, so coming through the, sorry, I'm getting some feedback. How do y'all hear me?
Loud and clear, Greg.
Loud and clear. We have you.
Okay. Yep. So hey, for the feedback coming out of the CTC rotations, again, I'll just go back to the Fort Johnson and what the Joint Readiness Training Center is doing down there. The big trend, and this kind of gets a little bit of what Jim Eisenhower was talking about. We are fighting our formations in a model that that may no longer be valid. And here's what I mean by that. So, a light infantry formation, for instance, tries to conduct battalion infiltrations to get into the enemy rear, to then seize an enemy strong point. And so you see there's a mix there. There's some growing pains associated with this transformation. And to me, that's the biggest shortfall we're seeing. So if you infiltrate to then go against the enemy's strength is packing a strong point. Light infantry aren't going to do well assaulting an urban strong point that's prepared and ready, but the enemy's ready for it. Vice, if you were to infiltrate behind the enemy and get deep and not be tied to lines of communication, you could potentially nullify his advantage or force him to displace, because now you've cut his lines of communication he's dependent on. So use our advantages to counter the enemy's strengths. Don't play to the enemy's strengths. And this mindset, whether it be terrain or enemy focused, is a choice that we're really struggling with. It sounds easy and fundamental, but when you do a combat power analysis for our company, soon-to-be company commanders out there, study the enemy's weaknesses and put your strengths against it, and then mitigate your weaknesses vis-a-vis the enemy. I'd say the other big trend related to this is our reliance on ground lines of communication. We are very reliant on that. And we have got to figure out ways to mix our plays, change how we sustain, change our rates of sustainment and our requirements, and learn to fight more decentralized and not tied to locks, because the enemy will certainly target them, and it becomes a very much a limiting factor for us and limits our freedom of a movement. And then I guess the other thing I'd ask, and you guys probably talked a lot about this, is a reinforcing point on massing. Massing effects is important, but massing formations has to be done very carefully and skillfully, because math attracts attention. And so you've got to, how you blend movement, fires, maneuver together to harmonize the massing of effects by presenting a target to the enemy that he it's too good to be true for. Those are kind of the three areas that I see as trends. Over.
Hey, thanks, Greg. Scott, it's a good question. My sustain for the CTCs is what the CTCs do. Ops groups are national treasures. The structure and the design and the monies our country gives us is incredible. I'm going to go into the improves because I think it'll be more helpful for everybody. So a couple of things. The first is battlefield framework. If you don't understand battlefield framework, I'd ask you to get into the doctrine really quickly. It's relatively simple, but I am still struck by the number of people who seem to not understand battlefield framework. It can solve lots of challenges in terms of simple navigation through that framework, literal navigation through that framework. You come up to a UMCP and you're trying to find the TAC, you realize you still need to go closer to the enemy, right? But the way we structure things on the battlefield is based off of a doctrinal knowledge that I think we're lacking right now. That battlefield framework is just as critical at echelon to making sure we're employing every warfighting function appropriately and then achieving the synchronization that gives us an edge against the enemy. Another thing is we fight from TACs. We spent 20 years fighting from very stable talks. And I have had to repeatedly remind subordinate commanders, you must be at the decisive point where you can sense the battle and make a decision based off of what you sense, because you're the most experienced person in that formation. The convenience of having access to all of the upper TI is very attractive. Leave that to staffs and analysts. Commanders have to be in attack, in the fight, at the decisive point to make sure that we're ready to exploit what happens there or change guidance accordingly. The other thing is I think we really need to watch our standards. As Manning continues to fall a little bit and we struggle with key, we're gonna rationalize in our own minds, if we're not careful, relinquishing or letting some of the standards ebb. And I think we need to remember how hard it is in combat, and then put that same stress and expectation on leaders, because if we change standards now in terms of our expectation of performance or operational design during CTC rotations, we're cheating leaders of tomorrow by denying them a precedent. The last thing I'll say is we need to get better at tempo. There was a time at the CTCs where we fought for a day, we did TLPs for a day. We fought for a day, and that tempo really puts pressure on an OP4, regardless of how proficient they are and familiar with that terrain. But right now, we've got to get back to that point where the tempo is sustained and we are fighting, transitioning the TLPs, making it as brief as possible, conducting those TLPs to standard, and getting right back into the fight to maintain the initiative. That, I think, will come with more repetition, but there's where I think we can improve in CTCs. Thanks, Scott.
Sir, thank you. I've got a question for General Anderson. It looks, what do intelligence, surveillance, and target acquisition capabilities look like in that definition that you provided for a true light infantry division? What does that structure look like within each of the domains?
Yeah, so, ISR for a division is hugely important. And, actually, to me, that's one of the areas I think we owe good feedback to the 2030 effort, and kind of how the light divisions are being designed. Division reconnaissance is critical to find a whole host of things, because whether you're a light infantry division or a JFE unit or part of the heavy strike, a division is going to have to shape and set conditions to enable the maneuver piece to work. So in a light infantry context, finding the enemy fires, finding the right routes, understanding, where the enemy air threat is, especially if you're going to be relying upon aerial resupply. And these are just to name a few of many, but the requirement for a robust ISR capability remains the same. We're playing around with some designs. I think something along the old LRS, the long-range reconnaissance units that previous light infantry units have used in the past, and our Army has used for decades, are still they're still valid. Getting dismounted teams that can sustain themselves for days and days on end to answer our PIR, to find our routes, to pinpoint the enemy, and potentially even to bring fires is going to be a requirement. Now pair them with a UAS company, right? Or blending reconnaissance in at the division level between the LRS and a UAS element tied to what we believe is a MCoE, a military intelligence company at the division level, is probably what we're going to need at the division level to enable light infantry forces to get done what they need to. Thanks for the question.
Sir, thank you. Moving over to the Slido questions, I'm going to target this one for General Eisenhower. As you've identified that SEED is a standard as a gap within your lessons learned, what recommendations do you have to correctly employ the Cavalry Squadron and other intel assets in order to enable that?
Well, we got some of the best doctrine in the world. Our problem is we don't read it. And so I think we follow our doctrine. I don't want to get into the details of, reconnaissance elements are part of our doctrine. We need them. So if you have them organically, then employ them. There's principles of reconnaissance, my favorite of which is there's nothing held in reserve. So you've got to have everything out front. I am always suspicious when security operations arise through the staff. I'd rather have my reconnaissance element out front, developing the situation so that I can make the right decisions as to how to employ combat power. So I think that's something that we always use. If you don't have it organically, then you ought to consider creating it. Right now, I don't have a dedicated division cavalry squadron, but that's okay. I've got all sorts of squadrons I can use. And we designate and train that organization. We put it out in front to good effect. The other thing I just remind you is that principle of reconnaissance, nothing's held in reserve. Remember everything that's out there that you can take advantage of. And there's a lot that you can use to stimulate some of that, whether it's social media or regular news reports, using your PAO to stimulate responses. Those things can help you develop an understanding of what's forward, and that really replicates the changing character of war. The only other aspect here I think that we probably need some doctrinal improvement in over the next 5 to 10 years is what that battlefield framework I referred to looks like for reconnaissance, when your reconnaissance should be characterized by non-human, and then you make a deliberate decision of when to employ human reconnaissance, and then how we delineate that within the battlefield framework to make sure that we're using them to their max capacity and then synchronizing that with the other warfighting functions.
Sir, thank you. I'm going to move over to the audience over on the right side.
Thank you, sir. Major John Austin, Brigade XO for 316 Cav. General Eisenhower, questions for you, sir. You mentioned a minute ago tempo, and General Rainey mentioned earlier being too heavy and having too long of a log tail. As a participant in the warfighters you mentioned before with 3 UK, 1st Cav, 3rd Armor Corps, I agree with you that we seem to do well, be mutually supportive at the division level with fires. We seem to my experience in the warfighters was that we often failed to exploit the initiative and to move quickly enough to take advantage of the gains we've made with that mutually supporting action. I know we have 20, 30 options, but what would you recommend now at the division level, particularly in ABCTs, in order to fix that problem?
Look, in the last warfighter, I called our DCGS once, and the problem was solved in about 6 hours, which I think for a division is pretty quick. I don't know that we accurately stress the logistical demands of a heavy force right now, or we do it honestly in a virtual or simulated environment, which is why I'm excited about January 24, where we're constructing an NTC rotation at the National Training Center for a division, but at distances we anticipate are more realistic to LSCO. All right, so all this is subject to approval by the appropriate leaders, but what I'm trying to do, I know how far it is from Bremerhaven to Milwaukee. It's just the same distance from Fort Bliss to Fort Irwin. So we ought to think about that and how we incorporate that reality into our typical CTC construct so that we can inform the Army about how you truly put a division under duress. We are the only Army right now. I was asked to go out to the Philippines and talk to the heavy division commander out there. 12 divisions, one of them's heavy, which really means it's got a couple of battalions that are heavy. And they're struggling with how you sustain that formation over a period of time. We're the only Army that I know of that does this with ABCTs at the CTCs, where we put it at doctrinal distances, where locks are doctrinally sound or associated with what we anticipate in LSCO. We need to do that for divisions now to really understand where it gets challenging, and then identify those capability gaps or those proficiency gaps and then fix them through that experience.
Sir, thanks for that response. What I'll do, based on that question, I've got another Slido for both commanders that indicates that, post 20 years of counterinsurgency operations have led us to be too reliant on large commands and command posts. What do you believe C2 nodes look like in an MDO environment in the future?
Greg, I'll let you lead.
Yeah, no, it's that's a question that we've been wrestling with for a few years, right? And we're seeing the significance now of what we're learning in Europe, that we better get a continued sense of urgency on this and get our design right. No more than 50 person in a brigade or potentially even a division C2 node. It's got to be small. It's got to blend in with the environment. If they're in urban, don't set a talk up when you can occupy an empty building. If you can get into basements, even better. If you can reduce your antennas that you need to, that's even that's even better. I'd tell you also in how we communicate. We've got exceptional encryption, and whether we're using low orbit satellite links, cellular backbones, cloud-based systems that anybody can move in small groups, get in, plug into the cloud, get what you need, transmit, and then move out. It's going to look more like that and less centralized. Everybody in a room for a bub. Bubs are going to probably have to be a commander and a small group of critical staff plugging back maybe hundreds of kilometers to the main staff where there's greater protection and potentially they can get more work done. Reach back is going to be important. The things that enable reach back so that leaders present at the points that they need to be and the friction points forward. That's never going to change. Commanders must go there. But at the same time, they can't drag big staffs with them to these points because they will attract attention and they'll suffer losses. And so, again, I think that there's a host of communication technologies that we're experimenting with and we're playing with. I think that's the future that enables us to get even smaller and smaller and blend into the terrain and environment ways that we typically do not recognize over.
So I'm going to hit it two ways. First, tactically, and then go a little broader. My experience in the MDTF is informing some of this response. First thing I'd ask you rhetorically is, how do you think we'd burden an ABCT or an IBCT at a CTC if we just took away all the upper TI? Because I can get all that feed at the division level and populate their lower TI. I think the onus is at the division staff level, but then I can free them up because all I think a BCT commander and subordinate battalion commanders need is to see themselves, to see the enemy, and have an understanding of the terrain. That's red and blue icons. And we burden them with upper TI requirements that create these massive talks that are just unreal. I was in a brigade talk in 1998 that was 6 SICUPs. Many of you don't even know what that is. but it was less than the size of half this stage. And we fought the same enemy pretty well. So I think we need to take a look at how we burden and what the expectations are. We've conditioned ourselves for the luxury of all that information, where commanders, I think, need to have an understanding of themselves, the enemy, and the terrain they're fighting on. And I think we might free them up to maintain some tempo and really pursue with some audacity and violence of action. The other aspect here I think we need a wholesale update is for the enterprise. And I don't know if there are any lawyers in the room, but one of the things that we tried to do in our last warfighter with the division is take some of the things I learned in the Pacific and just hide in plain sight. So we went under nets in the field where everybody could see, triple strand concertina around it because it's a J skiff and everybody knows what the hell that is. Or if you don't, you know you should target it. And then we jumped into non-standard locations where we were hiding in and amongst the infrastructure at Fort Bliss. We did a Wi-Fi poll, and Ops Group can show you, we were close enough to housing areas, you couldn't really tell where the division main was. And then we jumped into a hangar. JSOC does this all the time. There's a reason. Hangars are good for all sorts of reasons, but boy, does it make it difficult. We had OCTs kind of frustrated because they couldn't find the division main. We dropped a pin for them, and then they could figure out where we were. But here's the problem. The law of armed conflict and the concept of distinction needs to be updated with the changing character of war. So that's a shot across the bow to all the lawyers out there. I don't go to anywhere without a lawyer, but we need to take a look at that because our current definitions of distinction mean that we can't seek to look like something else. And I don't want to drive around in a civilian truck as a division mobile command group with Enterprise rental shuttle painted on the side. But if it's a plain white truck, I ought to be able to use that to hide in plain sight. I'm not going to put a VS-17 on the top to say, bring smoke on me. Likewise, when it comes to military deception, most of our policies are rooted in Cold War era. That's no joke. So we need to take a look at the enterprise level of how we enable commanders, tactical and operational commanders, to function within the changing character of war where we all learn how to hide in plain sight, knowing that we are always going to be in contact. And that's going to take some quick action.
Gentlemen, thank you both for taking the time today, providing us your lessons learned, insights in increasing our understanding. Again, thank you for taking your time out today from your busy schedule to join us. We truly appreciate it. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thanks, Scott.